The Pacific Ocean covers more than 60 million square miles of the Earth's surface. It is wider than the moon is distant from the ground beneath your feet. It holds more than half of all the water on the planet. And in the middle of it, there is nothing. No land. No sound except wind and the movement of water against itself. No marker to tell a person where they are, or how far they have come, or how far remains. Sailors have crossed it with instruments, maps, and engines. Even then, it humbles them. Even then, it reminds them that their presence on its surface is temporary and conditional. For most of human history, to be lost on the Pacific was simply to be gone. The ocean does not chase. It does not pursue. It only continues, in every direction, at every depth, with complete indifference to what floats on its surface. A vessel caught without power on the open Pacific does not sink immediately. It drifts. Slowly. The current takes it. The wind adjusts its path. And the days accumulate, one against the next, with nothing to mark them except the rising and setting of the same sun. This is where Salvador Alvarenga spent 438 days of his life. Salvador Alvarenga was born in El Salvador sometime in the early 1970s. The exact date varies across different accounts, and Alvarenga himself was never precise about it. What is documented is that he grew up near water, that fishing came to him early, and that by the time he reached adulthood he had already spent years working the sea in various capacities along the Central American coast. At some point in the years before 2012, he crossed into Mexico and settled in the small coastal village of Costa Azul, in the state of Chiapas. It sits on the Pacific side of Mexico, close to the Guatemalan border. It is not a resort town. It is a working coast, rough, functional, and largely unnoticed by the outside world. The men who live there fish for a living, often going out before dawn and returning when the catch was enough or the weather made staying out impossible. Alvarenga worked for a local boss named Willie, a boat owner who ran small fishing operations out of the village. Alvarenga's job was to go out far, farther than most local fishermen were willing to go, and bring back large hauls of shark, marlin, and other deep-water fish. He was known as a capable open-water fisherman. He had spent years developing instincts for weather, for current, for the behavior of the sea and conditions that would send less experienced men back to shore. He was not reckless. He was experienced. That distinction matters. In November 2012, Alvarenga was preparing for a routine fishing trip. These trips were not short coastal runs. They were multi-day expeditions into open water, sometimes reaching 70 or more miles offshore. His vessel was a small open fiberglass boat, roughly 23 feet in length, powered by a single outboard motor. It was the kind of boat designed for these waters, common along that stretch of the Mexican Pacific coast, practical, stripped down, built for function rather than comfort. For this particular trip, Alvarenga needed a helper. A young man named Ezequiel Cordoba agreed to go. Cordoba was in his early 20s and relatively inexperienced on the open ocean. Some accounts suggest this was only his second or third time going out on a deep-water trip. He was not a seasoned fisherman. He was young, willing, and available. On the morning of November 17, 2012, the two men left Costa Azul before sunrise. The weather was acceptable. The plan was standard. They would head out, fish for a day or two, and return with enough catch to justify the trip. They brought ice for the fish, some food, water, and basic equipment. They had a radio. They had their motor. They had everything that a trip like this was expected to require. By the following day, none of it would be enough. The storm came on the second day. Weather systems along the Pacific coast of southern Mexico can change quickly and without much warning, particularly in November when the tail end of the season still carries enough energy to produce dangerous conditions offshore. What began as manageable wind and rising swells escalated into something that overwhelmed the boat's ability to function. The waves grew. The wind increased. Alvarenga pushed the outboard motor hard, trying to hold position and then trying to return toward shore. At some point during the storm, the motor was damaged beyond use. Exactly when and exactly how is not certain, but the result was absolute. Without power, the small fiberglass boat had no ability to move against the current or the wind. It could only receive whatever the ocean chose to deliver. Alvarenga got the radio working and made contact with his employer, Willie, back on shore. He reported their position and their condition. Willie contacted the Mexican Coast Guard. A search was initiated. But the conditions were too severe for rescue vessels to reach them, and the window during which their position was approximately known closed quickly. The current was already moving them. Every hour that passed put them further from the coordinates Alvarenga had reported. The Coast Guard called off the search after a few days. From the shore, the conclusion was reasonable. A small open boat, no motor, in those sea conditions, that far out, the men were presumed dead. It was not an unreasonable assumption. It was simply wrong. By the time the storm fully passed, Alvarenga and Córdoba were already far beyond any realistic reach of rescue. The coast of Mexico was behind them. The Pacific was in every direction. The current pulling them was the North Equatorial Current, a slow and massive movement of water that runs westward across the ocean, covering thousands of miles before it reaches land again. They had no motor. No working means of propulsion. No way back. The drift had begun. The first days after the storm were the most disorienting. The sea had calmed. The sky had cleared. And the silence that followed was of a kind that neither man had experienced before. There was no engine sound. No reference point on the horizon. No vessel traffic. Just the low sound of water moving against the hull and the occasional cry of a seabird passing overhead without stopping. Alvarenga took stock of what they had. The supplies they brought for a 2-day fishing trip were already partially consumed. There was some food remaining, tortillas, fish they had caught before the storm hit, a small amount of drinking water in containers on board. There was ice in the cooler, which would melt within days. There were fishing lines, hooks, and basic tools that came standard on any working fishing boat. There was a knife. That was largely the extent of it. Alvarenga understood immediately that the food and water they had on board would last days, not weeks. If they were going to survive beyond the first week, they would need to source everything from the ocean around them. This was not a comfortable conclusion. But it was a clear one. And clarity, in the early stage of their situation, was something Alvarenga held on to deliberately. He began fishing within the first days. Using the lines and hooks already on the boat, he caught small fish that gathered in the shadow beneath the hull, a common behavior for open ocean fish, which seek any floating structure as shelter. The fish came steadily enough in the early weeks. Alvarenga killed them, cleaned them with his knife, and they ate them raw. There was no means of cooking. Raw fish provided both protein and a small amount of moisture, which mattered as their drinking water supply dwindled. Rain became the most critical variable in their survival. When it rained, Alvarenga collected water using anything available, buckets, containers, even clothing wrung out afterward. He stored what he could. On days when no rain came, they went without fresh water. Alvarenga later described drinking turtle blood during dry periods, which provided hydration in the absence of rainwater. Sea turtles surfaced around the boat with some regularity, and catching them by hand became a learned skill over time. Birds also landed on or near the boat. Alvarenga caught them when he could. He ate them raw as well. He saved the parts he did not eat immediately, using them as bait for fish. Nothing was discarded if it had further use. Córdoba struggled with all of this. Eating raw meat was deeply difficult for him, both physically and psychologically. He was younger, less experienced, and the conditions of survival that Alvarenga adapted to with grim practicality were harder for Córdoba to accept. Alvarenga encouraged him. He insisted. He understood that Córdoba eating was not optional, that refusing food on the open ocean was not a preference but a path toward death. In those early weeks, a routine began to form. Not a comfortable one, but a functional one. Fishing in the morning. Watching the sky for rain. Sleeping in shifts. Checking the horizon for ships. No ships came. But the routine held them together. For a while, it was enough. Time on the open ocean does not move the way it moves on land. On land, time is marked by obligation. By work, by meals at fixed hours, by the sound of other people moving through their days. On the open Pacific, far from any shore, time is marked only by light and darkness. The sun rises. It crosses the sky. It sets. And then it rises again. After enough repetitions, the days lose their individual character. They begin to compress into something continuous and undifferentiated. A week feels like a day. A month feels like a week. And yet the body keeps an honest count. It grows thinner, weaker, and more worn with each cycle of the sun, regardless of how the mind perceives it. By the second month, Alvarenga and Cordoba had consumed everything they had brought from shore. Everything they ate from that point forward came directly from the ocean. Fish. Turtles. Birds. Rainwater when the sky provided it. Nothing else. There were stretches, sometimes lasting many days, when the fish disappeared. When no rain fell. When the turtles did not surface. These were the periods that tested the limits of what the body can endure. Alvarenga described going days without fresh water during the driest stretches, surviving on whatever moisture the raw flesh of fish and turtles provided. The human body's tolerance for dehydration has narrow limits. That Alvarenga navigated those limits repeatedly without permanent organ failure is a medical fact that researchers and doctors who later examined him found difficult to fully explain. His weight dropped steadily throughout the ordeal. By the time it ended, he had lost approximately 70 pounds from his already lean frame. The psychological challenge of the middle months was different in character from the physical one. The physical demands were concrete: find food, find water, stay warm at night, stay protected from the sun during the day. These were problems with actions attached to them. The psychological challenge had no action attached to it. It was simply the weight of not knowing. Not knowing how far they had drifted. Not knowing whether anyone was still looking. Not knowing whether the next day would bring rain or continued drought, fish or continued absence. Alvarenga developed internal strategies to manage this weight. He spoke aloud, to himself, to God, to the ocean. He maintained the routine of fishing and watching and sleeping not because it was always productive but because routine itself was a form of resistance against psychological collapse. To stop doing things, to surrender the rhythm of survival activity, was to allow the mind to turn entirely inward. And an entirely inward mind, in those conditions, with no external stimulation and no forward momentum, could become dangerous. He thought about his daughter, who was living in El Salvador. He held on to that connection as something real in an environment that had otherwise stripped away every real thing he had known. She was not with him. She could not hear him. But thinking about her was an act of will, and acts of will kept him present. The boat continued its slow westward drift. The ocean offered no comment on any of it. It simply continued, as it always had, in every direction, without end. And still no ships appeared on the horizon. Ezekiel Cordoba began to decline somewhere around the third or fourth month. The precise timeline is difficult to establish with certainty. On the open ocean, without a calendar or any fixed reference point, even Alvarenga's own account of when things happened is approximate. What is documented is the pattern of Cordoba's deterioration, and the direction it moved in once it began. Cordoba stopped eating. It was not a sudden refusal. It was a gradual withdrawal. He ate less. Then less again. Then almost nothing. Alvarenga pressed him. He caught fish and brought them to Cordoba directly. He urged him, argued with him, tried to reason with him about what would happen if he continued to refuse. Cordoba's responses became quieter over time. He spoke less. He moved less. He spent More of each day lying in the bottom of the boat, looking upward at the sky or at nothing in particular. Whether Cordoba's refusal to eat was a psychological collapse, a physical one, or some combination of both is something that cannot be determined from the outside. What is known is that the human body, already weakened by months of minimal and irregular nutrition, cannot survive an extended refusal to consume anything at all. The process, once it reaches a certain point, becomes irreversible. Alvarenga watched it happen and could not stop it. Cordoba died sometime in early 2013, approximately 3 to 4 months into the drift. He was in his early 20s. What followed was one of the most difficult passages of Alvarenga's account. He was alone on a 23-foot boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with the body of the young man he had been unable to save. He stayed with the body for some period of time, accounts suggest several days. He spoke to it. He was not ready, immediately, to let it go. Eventually, he committed Cordoba's body to the ocean. He had no ceremony to offer. No words that felt adequate. He did what the situation required and then he was alone. Completely alone. The boat did not change. The ocean did not change. The sun continued its path across the sky with the same indifference it had shown since the first day of the drift. But something in the nature of Alvarenga's situation had shifted permanently. The weight that had been distributed between two people now rested entirely on one. He was still more than a year from land. There is a particular quality to solitude that only becomes apparent when it is total. Most people who experience loneliness do so within a world that still contains other people. The solitude is relative. There are walls, but beyond the walls there is a city. There is silence, but beneath the silence there is the knowledge that sound exists somewhere nearby. That kind of loneliness is uncomfortable. It is not the same thing as what Alvarenga faced after Cordoba's death. He was alone on a surface that extended, in every direction, further than the human eye could resolve. There was no beyond the walls. There was no beneath the silence. There was only the boat, and the water, and the sky, and himself. He began to talk. He talked to his family. To Cordoba. To God, in the way that a person raised with faith returns to it when there is nothing else to hold. He talked to the fish he caught, to the birds that occasionally landed on the edge of the boat and regarded him with brief animal indifference before departing. Talking was not a sign of psychological failure. It was a management strategy. It kept his own voice present in an environment that had otherwise gone completely silent of human sound. He reported hallucinations during the later months of the drift. He described seeing people on the boat who were not there. He described hearing voices. These are documented responses to extreme prolonged isolation and sensory monotony. The brain, deprived of external input for long enough, begins to generate its own. Alvarenga recognized, at some level, that what he was seeing was not real. That recognition itself was a form of psychological resilience, the ability to observe his own mental state without being entirely consumed by it. He made a decision, consciously and repeatedly, to stay alive. Not once. Many times. Every day that offered nothing, no rain, no fish, no ship on the horizon, required the decision to be made again. He kept making it. The ocean continued west. And Alvarenga continued with it. On January 29, 2014, Alvarenga saw something on the horizon that was not water. It was low and dark and did not move the way clouds move. It held its position as the boat drifted closer. It took time for him to fully accept what he was seeing, because by that point his mind had learned not to trust everything it perceived. But this did not dissolve. It did not shift or reshape itself into open water. It remained solid and fixed and real. It was land. The island was part of the Marshall Islands, a remote archipelago in the central Pacific Ocean, roughly 6,700 miles from the coast of Mexico where he had departed 438 days earlier. The specific island was Tile Islet, a small and sparsely inhabited piece of land that sits far outside the routes of regular maritime traffic. Alvarenga reached shore and made his way to a small house occupied by a local couple. They did not speak the same language. He did not need language to convey what they could see with their eyes. He was skeletal. His hair was long and matted. His skin was darkened and damaged by more than a year of direct sun exposure. He could barely walk. The couple took him in. Word reached the outside world within hours. He was transported to the capital, Majuro, where doctors examined him. What they found was a man whose body had been reduced to its absolute minimum and had continued functioning regardless. His organs were intact. He was malnourished and severely weakened, but he was alive. The drift was confirmed at 438 days. The distance covered was estimated at more than 6,700 miles. He had survived. Alvarenga returned to El Salvador after his rescue. He was reunited with his daughter, whom he had thought about every day on the water. The reunion was documented. The photographs from that period show a man still visibly diminished, thin, quiet, not quite settled back into the world he had left behind. He did not emerge from the experience unchanged. That would have been impossible. Extended isolation of that duration, combined with the death of a companion and the physical deterioration his body endured, leaves marks that do not fully resolve. He spoke in later interviews of difficulty readjusting. Of the ocean remaining present in his mind long after he had left it. Ezequiel Cordoba's family in Mexico received the news of his death. They had already been living with his absence for over a year, presumed dead alongside Alvarenga from the earliest days after the storm. What they received was confirmation rather than surprise, but confirmation carries its own particular weight. Alvarenga's account was published as a book in 2016, documented by journalist Jonathan Franklin, who spent considerable time interviewing him about the details of those 438 days. The account was scrutinized. Some questioned parts of it. But the physical evidence, his condition on arrival, the drift pattern of the currents, the confirmed timeline, supported the essential truth of what he described. What the story leaves behind is not a lesson, exactly. It is more a demonstration of what the body can endure when the mind refuses a particular outcome. Of how long a person can exist on almost nothing when the alternative is not existing at all. The Pacific Ocean continues as it always has. It does not remember him.